Okay. We all good? Um, are you talking to us, Kemi? I can't hear you. Corey, can you hear Kemi?
No, not yet. I can't.
Okay. Kemi, try talking again. Technology
Yeah, I
is
know.
not
Yeah, sometimes like when you switch like the audio source, you gotta like manually go in and say like speaker from AirPods or from.
right. Nah. All right. Okay. Welcome to the popular um music, books, and process series. Um, all events save one this winter are scheduled for Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Email froyster@dpaul.edu to be added to the series email list and to get Zoom links. Um, you can watch the video of all the presentations on Eric Weisbar's YouTube channel soon after the event happens. You can find the whole calendar for the series on IASPM US website under the Journal tab. The series is co-organized by Kimberly Mack, Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, Carl Wilson, and with me sitting in for Eric Weisbar this year, as Eric is on a Fulbright scholarship out of the country. The series is sponsored by the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPN US, and the POP Conference. In a few weeks, on February 12th, we'll have Ben Apatow talking about body count and Michelle Duma talking about Cardi B's invasion of privacy for the 33 and the Third series. But today we have Corey J. Miles and Kemi Adeyemi talking about getting the vibe to feel right. And I'll give brief bios for our speakers. Corey J. Miles is the author of Vibe, The Sound and Feeling of Black Life in the American South from University Press of Mississippi. Corey J. Miles is an assistant professor of sociology and Africana studies at Tulane University. He's the author of Vibe, The Sound and Feeling of Black Life in the American South. His research is a conversation between the intimacies of Blackness, hip hop, racialized emotions, carcerality, and ethnography. He has received funding from numerous organizations, such as the American Sociological Association, to engage in work that challenges disciplinary bounds and demands thinking beyond discipline altogether. This work has been published in outlets such as Cultural Studies, Humanity and Society, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Kemi Adeyemi is the author of Feels Right, Black Queer Women and the Politics of Partying in Chicago from Duke University Press in 2022. Kemi is Associate Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington. Her practice uses performance as a site and methodology for theorizing the contours of contemporary Black queer life. She wrote Feels Right, Black Queer Woman and the Politics of Partying in Chicago, and co-edited Queer Nightlife from University of Michigan Press in 2021 with Kareem Kambuch Hadani and Ramon Riveras Silveira. Her most recent writing has appeared in GLQ, Women in Performance, and in the Rutledge Handbook of African American Art History. Please place your questions in the chat, and Francesca will lead the Q&A after the conversation, where she will ask you to unmute and ask your questions. Also, use the chat for comments and discussion. And now we'll turn the conversation over to Corey and Kemi.
Hey everybody. I guess I'll just start by saying thank you to Kemi for volunteering to do this with me. I guess kind of how this came together was but yeah, I really just wanted to have a conversation with Kemi because their work is like beautiful and dope, and I thought this was like an interesting way to do this. So thank you for doing this with me. And kind of how we imagine it flowing was we'll both do like a few minutes, kind of like about our book, and then just engaging in the conversation. Yeah. And so for me, I don't know, sometimes I get tired of like the formal, I'm gonna do 30 minutes talking about my book. Well, just because I don't like to hear myself talk for that long amount of time. But yeah, and so my work vibe really comes out of me being a trained in sociology and Black studies, and me not only thinking about conceptual questions around performance, Blackness, and the South, but also thinking about what does it mean to be trained in a discipline and kind of to have discipline shape our imaginations, our desires for not only our careers, but also kind of what we imagine a research project can and can't be. And so sociology, right? I think we're in a moment of like big data, and at least how I read the history of sociology, we seem to be kind of hell bent on notions of objectivity, of trying to kind of capture and say something truthful about the world. And so for me, Bob was an attempt to kind of push back against that a little bit. Um, about to kind of denaturalize this desire to know more, to get it right, and say, can we learn something from the slippages? Can we learn something from right the ways like we fail to account for Blackness? I think in Kemi book, she mentions I believe like Kai Green's quote, or in part thinking about kind of like with our projects, I feel like we're doing research and we're writing about communities, but we're also saying something about ourselves and kind of the I don't know the. And I think when I'm writing about me, you become more cognizant, I guess, like the impossibility of our wholeness, to where I feel like I know myself relatively well, but some things I feel about myself, I just don't know how to articulate it. And can that not necessarily be a failure, but can that be something to embrace, right? Our failures at being able to approximate an experience. And so for me, I'm thinking about not trying to make better theories for sociologists, right? Not this ongoing process of getting closer to something that we might call truth, but thinking about how those failures, right, can be important for our empirical concerns. And so I do 4 years of ethnography in Northeast North Carolina, and in my book I call it the 252. It's 30 rural towns, and in North Carolina, since particularly the Northeast, since the towns are so small, like if you say the name of a town, nobody's gonna know it. So we go by the area code, the 252. And part of the reason why I went back home, first because of kind of how rural Black Southerners get written out of time, to where a lot of us wouldn't imagine that rural Black people in a town with one stoplight might have something important to say about, right, what's going on in Palestine. To where if, right, policing has its roots in history in, right, slavery, particularly, right, is argued that the first slave patrol and subsequently police department was in rural North Carolina. But a lot of contemporary work about carcerality doesn't center the rural South. And then so part of me thinking like, what happened to this type of historical kind of right discongruency, where if we will say, yeah, slavery, right, is kind of interconnected to the history of policing. Um, how do we get to a point where the urban center, right, shapes our imagination about carcerality? And so part of what I'm trying to do is bring rural Black Southerners into these, I guess, like modern conversations about hip hop, about performance, and think about what are the logics, not just that rural Black Southerners have been written out of our imagination, but what are the logics that led to that process? And so I'm thinking about, right, the South and trying not to take it for granted. So a lot of my work is thinking about where is the South? And North Carolina, I would call like up South. So it's not like deep South, but it's kind of right. 252 is at the uppermost right tip of the Black Belt. And think about what does that mean? Like that to identify Southern, to identify with any geographical space. And so for me, right? Geography is about both space and time. So when I say what and where is the South, part of what I'm thinking about um, is when folks, particularly from North Carolina, argue about their southernness, right? People typically talk about racialized histories. They talk about Jim Crow. So similar for like people in Maryland. If somebody's debating about, oh, is Baltimore the South? If somebody wants to make that claim, they might talk about, right, Frederick Douglass. They might talk about, right, these other types of racialized experiences that, right, maps don't really gesture towards. And so for me, I'm thinking about, why do we name North Carolina the South, or why does it feel Southern? And like what I get to is a type of relationality, is a relationship with a particular type of racialized history, slavery, Jim Crow, and then kind of bouncing off that. Then part of my claim is that similar to Malcolm X, where if it's about relationality, in some ways we can think about being anywhere southern of the Canadian border. It's like South, right? This is like the argument Malcolm X makes, or more recently, Kiese Layman, um, in his memoir, he's pulled over by a police officer in a supposedly progressive, right, New York. And he looks at the field and says, I think Mississippi's on the other side of that field, where he's kind of collapsing our imagination that there's something geographically distinct and different about a supposedly like progressive, right, New York, and right, a supposedly racist, right, Mississippi. And thinking about, why do we feel like a place is where it's at? And that's also a temporal type of question, where are we out of what people would call the old South? To where I'm thinking about what type of constellation of changes would have had occurred for us to say we're in a new South. And like, what are we making that assessment off of? So me thinking about where's the South is thinking about, right, space and time. And I'm trying to do that through trap rappers. So women and men who rap about drugs, violence, killing, and trying to think about, can these non-normative feelings tell us something about space? Can they tell us something about how we know where we are? And for me, what I realized is people who rap about guns and drugs actually feel a lot of stuff. And that stuff that kind of makes up the softest and hardest parts of themselves, if we use that as a type of cartography, what would it tell us about where the South is? And for me, the South is a violent place, it's a carceral space. But I think we make pockets and moments that, to use Kemi's word, right, feels right. Maybe not necessarily good, and that's something I want to ask Kemi about. But I think the South feels right for a lot of people, despite what the regions kind of organized to do. So yeah, so there's a long-winded type of introduction to my work, my thinking, and yeah, and I'll pass it over to you, Kemi, to share about yourself and your work. And yeah, and I can't hear you, Kemi, if you are talking. Still not coming through.
Okay, can you hear me at all?
Yeah.
Sorry about this. Let's see. Nothing?
Yeah. Oh, it's working now.
Okay, it's working. All right, good. Sorry about the tech stuff. Thank you so much for inviting me to be in conversation. I was really, feeling a lot of gratitude to get your email and your invitation and to be able to read your book, which I probably wouldn't have come across just because disciplinary, differences. I'm not really reading in sociology, even though I think methodologically we have kind of a lot in common. So I'm happy to be in conversation with you. And just sort of like a quick overview of my book. I'm using this idea of feeling right and thinking, like you said, about the relationships between feeling right versus feeling good. And the idea that something should feel good is so central to how, urban development, redevelopment, heavy air quotes, and gentrification, how it proceeds in Chicago, not only as, modes of like changing the infrastructure of the city, you know, zoning code changes and like public transportation, all of these structures that bring us to a particular place, specifically to like make us buy things, whether it's, you know, sort of commercial transactions or in my book, I'm really focusing on areas that are really, there's a lot of investment in the service economy. So, you know, food, drink, coffee shops, bars, nightclubs, or whatever, and really trying to make the argument that these kinds of development schemes are not only about grounding us in a specific architecture, but in, you know, structured ways of feeling, you know, structures of feeling that we are supposed to feel good there. And, you know, the better that the institution can make you feel, the more that you're able to participate in that, not only like exchange, but that good feeling, the sort of best, you know, the better you are at being like a good, proper, you know, citizen of the neoliberal city. And that might feel really good, but it does not often feel right for the Black queer women who are the focus of my work. And so I'm really looking at their participation in the nightlife scenes within and around these neighborhoods, these gentrifying neighborhoods, these gentrified neighborhoods, to see how their, you know, maneuvers around the dance floor, which are related to how they move through the city, tell us something about feeling and a right to feeling as central to how Black queer people navigate, you know, neoliberalism and neoliberal urbanism in particular. And so what does it mean that, you know, you can move through a neighborhood and feel really good, but it doesn't feel right? And how do Black queer women occupy queer dance floors in ways that produce this feeling of rightness that is sometimes contrary to, but sometimes overlaps with good feeling. But usually it falls apart. Like usually it does, you know, participating in, you know, Black queer nightlife for a lot of the people that I've been interviewing does not feel good. But, you know, there's this, you know, this is sort of constant return to the dance floor, like in the hopes that next time it'll feel good, and in the hopes that it will feel right. So I think there's like, I think there's a lot of conversations between our books, but I think one of the things that has been a framework for me in thinking about what's happening on these dance floors is this idea that the city is not only territorializing where we go in very, very racialized ways, but then how we're supposed to feel in there. And so there's this like collapse of, I call it the racialized territorialization of feeling. That process is never disconnected. The process of like producing good feelings is never disconnected from the process of producing, you know, segregated spaces. And so I was just very interested in how the, you know, the Black queer women that I'm talking to narrate their right to be in a space, not only as a spatial emplacement, but as a right to a complex set of feelings in that environment as well. And that's where a lot of, you know, my book is like very much about conflict, and a lot of the conflict that comes up in each chapter, which is about a different dance scene, a lot of the conflict comes up around this sort of gap between, you know, I'm supposed to feel good here. I'm like surrounded by other Black queer people and it doesn't feel right. And them trying to negotiate physically and affectively, administratively, in terms of how the party is organized, people trying to negotiate, like getting to that that feeling right. And it kind of never, I don't think it really happens throughout the whole book. And that's really interesting to me. And I think the fact that it's so unresolved in each party, and I think unresolved, you know, by the end of the book, is the kind of lived experience of, you know, being Black and being queer in the city, or in a city like Chicago as well. Yeah, I guess that's the sort of overview. I think that we have like a lot of methodological overlaps in terms of how can we use feeling, which is kind of like ambiguous in the air. It's like, you know it when you see it, you know it like when the vibe is right, like it's right. How can we use feeling as a method of ethnographic inquiry? And I appreciated how you sort of demonstrated feeling as method in your book. It's like a very sort of intimate, loving book, the way that you're writing toward your interlocutors. And so I just like, upon reading it, like, of course you read the abstract of the book and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then like the experience of reading it felt really like you were doing the work that, you was of course set out to do, but I think you were doing the work sort of in the tone of your writing that I wished that I had been able to draw out in some ways. So, I'm like a low-key hater on sociology, in part because of how sociologists write. And so I was really pleased that this was, after putting sociology down for a long time, I was very pleased to kind of pick it up and have this tone. Yeah, so I appreciate that. I'll kind of leave it at that. I kind of figure like as we talk, more of the minute details of like what's happening in the work will come through.
Look, nah, that it made me laugh because it made me feel special and seen. And yeah, part of it, when I read your book, something I wish I would have done a lot better is kind of how you talked about, I guess, methods and what you were doing. And so like my book doesn't, typically sociologists do like a methodological appendix, but I didn't do one. And I feel like a lot of the stuff I was trying to do or show, I think it might be better received if I had kind of articulated it. And then I feel like a person would have to really reread this to kind of know what I'm doing methodologically, since I never really kind of say what it is. And so, no, I really appreciate that. And I think like the first thing it would be interesting to think about, particularly because you were mentioning the methods piece, is because I didn't want my work to kind of be like this autoethnographic thing, but what ended up in the final version of it was a lot of stories about kind of me, like my mother, in part because at some moments when I was like critiquing folks, I felt like I could make some critiques so good because I had the same bullshit, or I felt similar ways that people I was kind of doing this work around. And then so part of kind of what I wanted then to do was say, you know what, I'm implicated in this in like complicated ways too. And so I would love to hear kind of about you and your feelings and feeling right and feeling frustrations, because I think you as a scholar made the book so fascinating to me, particularly like the story with like the Black girl saying, right, I'm the only nigga here. And then like you kind of doing this interesting work and we're saying, well, shit, I'm here, right? And it's like this kind of subtle but like powerful way you kind of implicated yourself in that moment in a way that like wasn't corny, it was like really kind of dope. And yeah, just kind of like, yeah, just kind of how did you feel doing the work, and like how much did kind of you're feeling right, wrong, bad, indifferent, how did that kind of shape the texture of the work?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a great question. And it's like, how deep do I get into the journey of doing ethnographic work, which, long, I think it was 10 years from start to finish. And I was doing interviews up until sort of the last, year and a half, 2 years. So I was in the scenes that I was writing about, but then I sort of move away. I'm in Seattle. And so, having to go back regularly to kind of tap back in and do more interviews and be in the sites, there's like that's a long period of time to feel connected and very disconnected from your field site. And that really shaped, of course, this relationship of feeling good and feeling right. Because going out and partying is really exhausting, and it was really fun when I started. And by the end, my preface is really about the exhaustion of doing this work and how tedious it becomes and how it doesn't feel good. But it gave me that perspective to be like, wait, I feel like nobody is having fun here. And like, nobody seems to be like really reflecting on like, damn, all these years I've been partying, I'm really feeling good. Like it kind of wasn't landing for anybody. And so I think I kind of was just following the track of what was already happening amongst the people that I was talking to. And also following the track of, over 10 years, these parties look very different. Each chapter is only sort of tackling like one slice and one era of each party, but like over the arc of it, when I'm kind of sitting down to really finish the book, even the path that the parties are taking and where they're trying to like suss out, like this party doesn't seem to be like working for the people that we started with 10 years ago, and we have a new audience, and like they want new sounds and new moves. And so the methods part, the doing of the research was always really entangled with the concepts that kind of that I needed to play with in order to kind of make sense of my data, for lack of a better word. Our interlocutors are not data points, but sometimes, collected together. So, yeah, I don't know if that quite really answers what you're saying, but like, I felt like a lot of room to sort of have bad feelings about the field that I was writing into as well, in terms of like, what is, queer nightlife as a sort of subfield, or, what is Black queer studies? What is performance studies? Like, how are we thinking about Black queer women? And the kind of neglect in the field was so evident too. Like I wasn't, when you're writing and you're really anxious, like, have I read all the right things? Like, are my footnotes right? Like, have I missed something? And 10 years in, I'm like, I haven't missed anything. Like there's there's like one or two studies of like Black queer women's nightlife. Like, and so I was like quite angry by the time I was, midway through the writing and really finishing the writing. And I think that comes out in that third chapter, which is very much about what methods are we deploying in performance studies in particular to think about Black queer life, Black queer women's lives and night lives. And so, yeah, I kind of could not avoid a very direct conversation on methods and like and staking a claim to why my method is important to, crafting the argument that I'm trying to make, and when we're reading like those methods manuals in grad school, that's what they're always saying. And it doesn't really, you understand it sort of intellectually, but it really kind of didn't really hit until I had something to say.
Yeah.
Basically. So yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers what you were thinking about.
No, yeah. Nah, it does.
I guess I'd be curious, like, because your book doesn't read like my imagination of what sociology demands of, of the sociologist. And it's, especially for like, thinking about like tenure and promotion. And it just looks very, in terms of format, very differently from my sort of imagination. So I'm just like wondering how you went about, honing that voice over the years.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, right? And I've particularly thought about it a lot, like when I was on the job market, like how do I make this thing, right, legible to, right, sociology? And luckily for me, at least on a surface level, right, sociology wants to perform a type of like progressiveness, right? So sociology has, right, attempted to say name Du Bois as the father of American sociology, and right, this retrieval of, right, Black thinkers, oftentimes at the expense of kind of narrowing down their actual intellectual projects. And so since sociology made that move, now I can say, okay, like, if this is what you claim to be about, then it's going to demand a rethinking of the logics of the discipline, to where if we look at, say, Du Bois's, right, the bulk of his work, I think the things that make him are the non-sociological things, right? And then so for me, then it's trying then to, at least at the institutional level, say, well, y'all claim to care about these things. Like, what does that demand of you to kind of change and shift and to reimagine? And so part of like my thinking was, I know sociology, and then can I communicate why what I'm doing is important for the discipline when a discipline might not see itself in it? And thinking with folks like, right, like Catherine McKintrick, who's thinking about is how disciplines like sociology, right, try to itemize their way to understanding Blackness. And it's not just in this retelling of these sad ass stories, but it's also in how boring the writing is, and where so Black life isn't just kind of masked through this focus on disparity, but it's also masked through text that's just lifeless. And can I make an argument through the way this sentence sounds, and then trying then to market that as an important for sociology and yeah. And so part of it is me trying then to one, make the claim that I think the crisis we're in, we can't like just legislate out of it, our way out of it. There is these other pieces to it, and that sociology can be important to influence policy, but that doesn't have to be at the expense of beauty, of care, of thinking differently. Where I think I guess like the last point to this. So whenever I publish, maybe only once in my life in a sociology journal, the editors asked me about, well, what are recommendations like from this work? Right? Like, shit, I don't know. Like, but I needed a publication, so I can write something, right? Even though I'm kind of like against just offering these kind of short-sighted recommendations. And after it got published, the editor never contacted me that asked me, did I try to put in a plan to kind of get those recommendations sought after, right? So they just kind of wanted me to artificially tell them some recommendations with no real interest in me kind of actualizing anything from it. And then so for me, I think I'm trying to do something where just call out the obvious silliness of kind of what we think is sociology. And then the other point is, sociology doesn't feel like my identity. So like my mama worked in a linen factory her whole life. But when she left the job, she never really thought about it. It didn't overwhelm her imagination about who she was as a person. And so I think I work in the sociology department, but the discipline, right, I try not to let it shape the texture of how I do life and the stories I tell. But I ain't got tenure yet, so we'll see how it goes. But yeah.
I mean, I think the drive toward recommendation, I've been thinking a lot about that. You know, I teach in my department, I'm in gender, women's sexuality studies.
Yeah.
And a lot of my students, and I'm teaching our intro class right now, and they always, you know, and they learn a lot about the violence of the world, and then they get very stressed out and overwhelmed. And their immediate impulse is, well, you know, what can I do? What behaviors do I need to change right now? Or how do I need to talk to people right now to change their, you know, behaviors? And it's a very, you know, they feel the urgency, which I totally understand. And I always say, you know, the only thing you have to do right now is learn how to define and describe the problem. You don't need to find the resolution right now, you know, maybe you just, because that's an immense amount of work to be able to incorporate the violence of the world, think about it, describe it, because the descriptions always need to be changing, you know, because the goalposts are always moving around what success looks like. And so I'm just like, just chill and like pay attention and learn how to describe. And I think that was really, I didn't frame it like as a solution or like what the offering of the book is, but for me, my project is always to demonstrate that people in my book, people in your book, that they have really skillful language for describing, you know, in the particularities of my book, for describing what neoliberal urbanization looks like and feels like. They're really astute critics of governance. They're really skilled at elaborating the kind of affective and embodied ways that you have to demonstrate, you know, so-called good citizenship, or, you know, I'm a good participant, or I'm good at belonging, whatever it may be, that they have really rich language and examples for not only, you know, how to live in oppressive systems, but how to live well. And I feel like that is, I don't want to use the word solution, just like you don't want to use the word solution, but like that's the work that we can do in these fields where we're not saying, okay, now here's a white paper, you know, implement it or whatever. So much of the work has to be reminding people in a racist society that the people that you are racist against have theories and politics and methods, you know, every day that they're kind of developing and adapting and adjusting. And I think that's a lot of work to even just try to convince people, you know, in the case of my book, that Black queer women are insightful critics of urban life, you know, and we should, you know, fundamentally just like listen to what they have to say about, you know, how they want to be governed and the kinds of cities that they want to live in, and on the sort of macro level, but also I think they do that political work at the scale of the nightclub, when they're interfacing with the party organizer, like, they're sort of doing the kinds of political theorizing that the city, the formal political structure, doesn't allow them to do, and they do it in the space of the night and the nightclub or on the street or wherever. And so, as academics, we have to be equally as skilled in like hearing people or watching them produce that theory as it's happening.
Oh, yeah, and it was a sentence in your book where it was trying to think about, right, Black queer women's performance is kind of beyond this binary of just either pleasure or like terror. And then I think about it in the context of my work where people like, oh, people rapping about guns and drugs, to what degree does this harm Black people? Or to what degree does, right, can it be liberating? To where sometimes it feels the frame, particularly about Black performance, is to what degree does this performance get us closer or move us further away from something called freedom, right? Particularly in kind of all the liberal ways in which we conceptualize what that is. And I feel like your work is doing something more interesting than just trying to kind of account for how much does this free us within like a neoliberal city, or how much did this kind of avoiding, right, all the stresses. But it seems like it's doing something more interesting. I just love, so that's not like a real question, but yeah, but just if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like sort of famously uninterested in conversations around freedom and liberation and what does it look like and how do we do it. Not that they're not important. I just am interested in a scale of movement that can certainly accumulate towards something that we call freedom or liberation, or that we can retroactively describe as freedom or liberation. But often, if we think about like the scale of the dance floor, there is a temporary release of, feeling good on the floor. But like in the context of the party, what does freedom mean if for 3 minutes you felt really good and then you got elbowed in the back, or like the bartender threw you out or cut you off, you know what I mean? And so I'm just sort of like, it's so temporary that again, not that it's like not useful or important to think about, it just isn't interesting for me. Like I'm like, something else is happening there. What else is happening there? And for me, it's sort of the dirty work of asserting yourself and your right to be, and your right to be in the city, and your right to feel how you want to feel in the city. And that, I think, is really naughty, because I think what we see then is, Robin Kelly, I'm not like, Robin Kelly was talking about this, like, we see that there is as much resistance to the machinations of like, capitalist rule. There's resistance, but there's also capitulation to it. There's no escape from it. And so I'm curious, like, what do people do in that trap? Like, what do they make of it and make out of it? So I think it's like more of like just a different kind of focus or emphasis than like doing away, because I think this is like a larger conversation, but I think our search for sites of freedom and liberation can result in kind of boring work. Predictable. It's just predictable. You either find it or you don't find it, and it doesn't help me think. And so I was trying to find a way to put into book form the kinds of really complex critical thinking that's happening in these scenes, and put it into book form, and not just say, because I could have written the book, look at all these beautiful liberatory spaces of, that would have been an easy as hell book to write. Would it have been interesting to read? No. And so, yeah. And I think like I found you doing a similar work in terms of saying that there are all of these legal definitions and descriptions of Black emplacement. We have, the area code, and we have the, geographic boundaries. But there's so much affective work that cannot be captured by the law, and like what modes of emplacement happen that, when we think about vibes, that not only can't be captured by the law, but sort of in a related sense, can't necessarily be captured by the dichotomies of like freedom and capture that kind of organize, I think, a lot of, not a lot, but organize a significant strain of Black studies work.
Yeah, definitely. And this might be me jumping far, but reading your book and having just kind of reflecting back, not necessarily on kind of like my ethnographic project, but just kind of like what does home feel like? Because I'm doing work in kind of an area code that I call home. And right in the book, I'm talking about, well, shoot, every time, right? Well, most times that like I've been a victim of a type of violence, it's been in the place I've called home. And which makes sense because that's the place I spent the most time at. So I'm more likely to be victimized there or to do my own type of harm there. And but but it feels so good to be there. And then something special about it, that exactly what you're narrating, that right, these type of legal or just even kind of the mainstream concepts of what we believe makes a person of and from a place, that I think like those concepts don't really kind of get to what makes home so important and special for the folks who are there, for the people I was thinking about, for why I wanted to go back home for my work. And yeah, and because I know now like concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? They're like the big hot topics, right? And this might be me reaching and stretching, but I think what I'm trying to do with my work and what I see in yours, right? It kind of, the stories call into question that, right? Because part of what you're demonstrating is, right, folks are trying to get to something more than kind of what just, right, jurisdictional, as like legislative rights can give you. It is getting to more than kind of just having access to resources in this particular space, but it's thinking about, can the softest parts of me, can, right, those shitty desires I have, can those be part of kind of building the social imagination of where this place is? And yeah, and then I think your work, right, gets to that, where it's these affective contours or our experience that tell us why a place is so important. And so for me, so in these rural towns, right, I'm not the best dressed person, but I think when people see kind of how I dress, it'll be associated more with, oh, he probably like grew up in a city. And so when I went back for my research, like people are like, where you from? I'm like, shit, I'm from around the corner. And then whenever I was saying I'm from here, people always ask me, well, who your grandma is, who your people are. And it's something about that question, right? That's a geographical question about, so who your people is thinking about your relationship to space and place. And then, yeah, and all that to say, I think your work is really getting to, right, this relationality of space in ways that I think conversations around equity, inclusion, access to resources, right, kind of falls, those things are important, but they fall short in some places, right? So
Yeah, I mean, because I kind of hear you saying that community is a practice. It's a practice of being in relation, and it's ongoing, and it takes a lot of work. And just titling it, getting the title, I'm the leader of community because I'm, the DEI head. We've seen that, like, if it's not a practice, if it's just the title, it's going to fall apart. And I think like that the so much of my book is about the hard work of I won't even say being in community, the hard work of trying to form community.
yeah.
Because I think it's like, even, a lot of what's happening on the dance floors is sort of anterior to the community. The community is like not even quite yet there. And when it's there, that feeling of it feeling right. And since that sort of arrives so infrequently, it just reminds everybody of like how hard, how much work, labor, like physical and affective it is. And so I think it's just like a sort of an intensification of what you're talking about, like the sort of sedimented networks of community that are like by genealogy, like, okay, I know like your family is here, and, and we have these relations in these ways. That's of course still an immense amount of work. It's just interesting to place that in like a larger city where some people may not have blood family and are trying really, really hard to like reproduce that feeling of feeling right in the family. And we know certainly in families, it might feel right, but it doesn't feel good. And it's the same kind of process, but you have to activate it as an adult. And it's just like so hard. It's so much work. It's so much work. Yeah. And then it's placed like in a party scene too, where it's like, can we really have a real conversation? Like, I see you every month for 10 years, but like, do I really know you? Like, what is community then? Like, what is that? Is that community, you know? And I think a lot of people, that starts to fall apart, especially the older that we get. Like, if you're not at that party every month, are you in community anymore? And I think huge anxiety for people.
And this might be a more important question for me, but I'm so interested in hearing kind of how you think about this question. Because part of what your book, right, provided for me is to show why, say, if we're like in this rural area and like a local artist performing, and most of their songs about, right, a lost loved one, and so it's like a sad or melancholy song, and like we talking about violence and death, and right, it doesn't necessarily right feel good, but to your point, right, it feels right. And in my work, I'm talking about right structuring a type of vibe, or just kind of like this social aura, and kind of how right that space itself, right, for me, sometimes vibe is thinking about not necessarily right individual people, how they feel, but just the affective possibilities of geography. And I would love to hear kind of how do you think about vibe? Because you use vibe a lot also. Yeah, just for you, kind of like what work does vibe do for you in your work?
Well, I think it's a way that we try to name how people feel we're trying to name how people connect without using words like I feel connected to you. And that's an affective and embodied experience and set of sensations as well. And that I think you're talking about sort of one genre through which those kinds of affective and embodied bonds are honored and acknowledged, and are like the material through which people connect with one another. And so it's sort of like a successful genre through which, you know, vibe is produced, and through which, you know, a sense of belonging is produced. I think in each chapter of my book, the sort of debates around what the music should be, you know, and when it's like not hitting for people is also, you know, that's, you know, those kind of conflicts around genre become kind of a stand-in conversation for the interpersonal conflicts that they're having. We're not connecting, you know, fuck the DJ. Like that kind of becomes the conversation. So I thought it was really interesting because like my book is so sort of conflict laden, and I really like enjoyed you talking about like pain music in particular as a point through which men, you know, hetero masculine men connect to one another. And, you know, I don't like think about men a lot. They're not in my research ever, you know, you know, we're forced to think about them because they're like the most violent subjects in our world. But so it was like a really interesting moment to like think about sensitivity and vulnerability, and how they can commune through this music where they can like have feelings, public feelings that are like socially acceptable. And I thought it was interesting because I was you know, following like on Twitter, like all the drama around Rod Wave recently, and how Ari Lennox had such a terrible time opening for him on tour.
Yeah.
She was like, his audience, you know, he makes like pain music, and she's like, his audiences are like mean and depressed and angry and misogynist and just upset. And I thought that was like such an interesting counterbalance to how that music is serving the people that you're in conversation with, where it's about organizing around community. And we have this sort of, you know, public celebrity battle around how antisocial, you know, pain music is. And I just like, I was thinking about that a lot. And I guess I would sort of throw your question back to you to sort of ask like, what's like a sort of ungenerous read of the music that you may have encountered, you know, through writing this book?
Yeah, and the Ari thing, yeah, that was just kind of seeing it unfold and yeah, and just kind of reading how people are kind of responding to it, like what's like the logics behind how they're kind of rationalizing what happened and yeah, and so yes, for me, I think right, an ungenerous read or kind of just kind of thinking about kind of what's actually happening. One, I think part of what I'm doing is at moments adding a layer of analysis to kind of what happens that folks may disagree with in the book. So kind of how I'm narrating kind of these experiences. So in part of it, right, what I try to do is talk about how kind of like these rural Southern Black men, right, kind of fail at being decent human beings sometimes, right? Because part of why I came to trap music because, right, my uncles, right, who cared for me, who loved me, who were soft with me. I never seen them be with one woman and treat them right their entire life. The Black women who cared for me, right, were violent with other people. So and trying to think about all these things kind of existing and trying to hold them. And so part of, I think, in the work, I maybe in kind of defense, it's trying to say in the imaginary of like these folks, right? I think a lot of the work I have to do is kind of show them as actual thinking, feeling people. And I feel like I did a lot of time to do that work in the little space I had. And I think your questions kind of get into just the otherness of it. And for me, my ungenerous read would be, I think pain music points to particularly like cis Southern Black men having a desire to be soft, to be gentle. And I think it gives them a kind of out to where they can use it as a space to be soft and gentle while still holding on to their bullshit. To where, oh, right, this is a space to feel and think, but within the boundaries, the acceptable boundaries of like how straight men and it's how can feel and think. And so I don't need to be more imaginative because, right, this is the space that kind of right gets me and gives me the things that I need. And so for me, it's thinking about how the sound, right, gets to, I think, Southern Black men's desire to like touch a body and make that body beautiful, to kind of play with their voice, right, to sound softer and lighter, stronger, and all these just like regular desires. But oftentimes I think they do it in unsophisticated ways where I think trap music, particularly pain music, can be a space of possibility that I don't see folks really doing. And so part of what I'm trying to say is, right, if we care about, right, which I think they've shown, like beauty, softness, right? What does it mean then to expand the type of body we imagine, those types of things that can, like the type of body we can direct care, compassion, and beauty towards. Well, yeah, I like that. That's a tough question because now I'm thinking about it, but yeah, so I don't know if that fully gets to it, but no, that's a really interesting question though.
No, I mean, I think you answered it. I think you answered it well. And I think you sort of did right by that project of trying to um, uh, document, for lack of a better word, the emotional complexity that kind of goes into the genre, even if it's sort of constrained by the genre. Yeah, but it provides a venue or like a structure where that complexity of I want to be soft, I want to be vulnerable, but I also have to live in I have to, succeed in a violent world, it's a sort of an apt, vehicle for that, which I think, yeah, you did well, it was like it was very well written in that regard, I think.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and look at and just like a quick question because I really love the quote. I can't remember their name, but it was like I fuck with queerness. And in your book, and part of what they were getting to was, which I think your book shows, right, is not that your book just right works with right queer Black women, but it's actually working with the type of analytical frame, a type of orientation, a way to think, like reshifting certain assumptions about the world. And so for me, I was thinking about can that type of frame also do a type of work in my book, even though most folks, right, that I work with wouldn't like self-identify, right, as queer. But yeah, I would just love to hear quickly just about that framework I see you working through, right? This type of like Black queer framework, where for me, it's something more than just Black queer subjects, but it seems like you're giving us a new set of assumptions about the world. And yeah.
I like that, giving people a new set of assumptions about the world. I think there is no assumption in the parties as they're happening. And I tried to replicate this in the book. There is no assumption that whiteness is the center, which is how we often write in the academy, sort of defensively against whiteness. But it's not even a frame of reference that people, you know, it's built into the environment, right? But it's not like a frame of reference.
Yeah.
People are like walking into the party like, well, now I'm gonna, you know, release my anger about white people. People are just not thinking about white people or straight people. And so I guess I'm just sort of thinking a lot because I haven't thought about this, you know, set of assumptions that we're working with. I mean, I think Black queerness is so commonsensical to the field site and to the people that I'm talking to and about, that it actually released me of some, you know, sort of institutional and disciplinary constraints, really constraints about how academic thought should proceed, right? I have to present the problem. The problem is whiteness. I have to, you know, here's my methods, and, you know, then I have to give the solution, which is, okay, now here's the solution. It's freedom from whiteness. Like, if I'm allowed to kind of take that off of the table and just talk about how, you know, Black queer life is produced in and of itself for itself, it kind of, I don't know, it just sort of, and I think you do the same thing. Like, I think it kind of opens us up just to be like literally thinking about anything else, which is a huge relief. And which is why people go to these parties, is to have that relief. Like, I don't even have to like get through the assumption that I'm supposed to be getting through something. You know, I'm just showing up because it's after work and I'm like tired and hungry and I just want to get drunk. Like, it's kind of, there's nothing else about it. I'm just here to fucking party. Like, leave me alone. There's nothing else to say about it. And even opening space for that, I think that, you know, sometimes partying doesn't result in anything, and people aren't striving for anything. They're just trying to hang out and party. And I don't, it's as the scholar who's come in, you know, as the ethnographer, if I try to twist that up into something else and something grander than that, like, I'm kind of doing a disservice to just, you know, what's actually happening. I'm making too much of it, you know, and I really didn't want to make too much of it. And so I think that those are some of the assumptions I think that I was writing against and beginning with. And, you know, I'll have to keep thinking about that though, because it hasn't been posed to me, you know, in that way.
Like, you know, you got me thinking about and well, is this in the book? So weird, because like I got memories. I'm like, shit, did I write about this? Because it feels so like important to the work. But yeah, just one of the artists who was just going out, he was like, man, don't be on that shit tonight. Where I was like, where me like talking about what we're doing is like so important. It's like, look, we get like, nah, let's just go. Like, and so yes, I think we can switch it over to comments, questions from the chat, if that's cool
That
with you.
sounds great. Yeah, thank you. Kemi and Corey, this is such a great flow, and I think you've really awakened a lot of great questions here. So the first one is from Lois Neighbor. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or you really have two questions if you'd like to do that.
Oh no. What was sorry.
Yeah, it was about queer women's scenes versus men's scenes. I think that was your
yeah.
first
Oh,
question.
that's right. So Kemi, I was just thinking as you were talking, and you kind of answered my question as you went along, but so much of the writing lately about gay men and nightclub scenes has been so euphoric and positive. And I was just wondering if you saw a fundamental difference between the women's scenes and the men's scenes, or are the men not thinking of it in the same ways you are? I guess is my first.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, and I think that I'm trying to think of how I can also maybe answer your second question in there. I think for me, the question or the problem, for lack of a better word, was less about what was happening, at the gay men's club versus the ones I'm looking at, and more about what are the impulses of institutionalized disciplinary thought that sort of make us write about these scenes in a euphoric way, because we've all, maybe, I don't know, but we've all been to the gay men's club, and if I would call it euphoric, no, not in a word, I wouldn't describe what's happening there as like people, this utopian euphoria. Like it's temporary, certainly, but it's also a really ugly space. And so for me, the question was really about like, wait, what are we doing as scholars to force an analytic of the utopian release or the euphoric release? And, in my third chapter, I'm really connecting that to the kind of the what do you call it? The universities that we're in that require us to make a precious object and make it that special and build our careers off of it. And, something like, and I talk about the spectacle of the drag show, for example, or the spectacle of the gay men's club, or the spectacle of, drugs, or whatever, these sort of objects that have animated nightlife studies are really well suited to university culture, where you have to make your own scholarship a spectacle in order to make it viable, and reproducible and fundable. And I think that it's not that, in Black queer women's nightlife, there are not the same sort of, seemingly euphoric spaces. And I just sort of make an argument that like the Black lesbian in particular is not useful in academic institutional structures, which depend on reproduction and, the ways that we configure the Black lesbian as a non-reproducing subject, very mistakenly, right? But she's not seen as useful to the project of star making, which is what too much of, performance studies and nightlife studies, queer studies has really been built on. And so it's not, this to just sort of reiterate, they're not differences for me in nightlife cultures, they're differences in academic culture and in the cultures of scholarship production.
That's cool. Okay, Christine, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi. Thank you. There's so much to think about. I have 5 more questions already, but I'll read the one I started to write. And it was when you, Corey, were talking about performing progressiveness. I heard this coming through for both of you. So I lived in the South from 2014 to 2021. And so I was at UT Austin in grad school when the Confederate statues came down, and then they started coming down in New Orleans. And then I was an adjunct at Tulane, and this might be not for a Zoom recording, but found that the most interesting conversations I had with students were Black queer students from smaller cities or rural Texas and Louisiana, navigating the space of a PWI, but then also like a classed Black population within the space as well. So for both of you, I'm thinking about different kind of vibes, not all of them that feel good or even right intersecting. So these institutions, so-called progressive cities, and then this knowledge from the South in general, or from particular people in the South, that's, valued in a way when it's useful to academic production. But then I remember all those calls to cancel the South when all the like anti-trans, anti-queer laws, anti-abortion laws started going through too. So would love to hear you more talk about how method, in terms of method, in terms of affect, you navigate these layers when you're exploring these neoliberal spaces. You've definitely been naming them, but I wonder, to hear a little bit more, because I'm just really interested in that. And thanks again.
Yeah, I don't think I got I love the question. I don't think I got a nice answer for it, but I will say that answer Kemi just gave, yeah, I'm glad we recorded this because that was, yeah. And yeah, and so thinking about, yeah, there's this notion, right, the cancel South. And so for me, those types of calls become, lack of a better word, right, strawman, or when we see a type of obvious blatant disregard, let the rest of us, right, offer a kind of an easy critique, which then sometimes masks the more complicated ways that, say, trans and queer folks face similar levels of violence that's done to the body, to the emotions, to the flesh, but it just may not read as, right, as obvious and blatant as it does in the South. And then, because I always think about, well, shit, the people who live there who are most impacted, what are they saying? Is this idea of mobility? Can I just move to this type of utopia where if this body were in another place, would this body then experience life? Maybe in some ways, but I'm not sure if a lot of folks, right, if movement, right, gets us out of kind of the ontological violence that I think some of our bodies just gonna face, right, regardless of region and geography. And excuse, and kind of what the theme I saw, or just kind of thinking about just the people I know from just experiences, even beyond my work, is, and thinking about Kemi's work is there are certain moments that just feel right and someone to feel good, and a commitment to how do we make that moment last a little longer, where I remember asking someone, like, what's happiness? Because like I was talking about emotions a lot, and someone, they said, well, happiness is a break from pain. Like pain is just a normative experience, and happiness are those moments that we kind of get away from it. And thinking about, does movement out and beyond the South, right, provide more moments of happiness? Maybe. I'm not sure, but thinking about it methodologically, I think for me, this question, I ask people a lot of times, like, how do you feel? And for me, that was important because in everyday language, we don't say, what do you feel? We say, how do you feel? And I think it's just such a sophisticated way, just in everyday life, we ask about how do we feel and not what we feel. Because I think how points to the mechanics of something. So how do you feel is thinking about a process, a way in which we do our affective worlds. And I think a lot of folks, at least methodologically, get into the how of feeling, people find alternative ways to live beyond kind of the legal ways in which space is organized. And sometimes it's not about an attempt to kind of get away from or out of the legal violence, but can we live differently, right? At least momentarily. And yeah, and so yeah, so that's kind of like a not so good answer, because I think when the question is important, right, the answers like don't have to be that good, because I think it's an interesting question that you're asking. Yeah, and Kemi, if you want to add to it, because I think what you're gonna have to say is more important.
You're good. You're good.
Okay, are you good, Kemi?
Yeah.
All right. Our next question, that was so profound. I'm going to go back and watch this and take notes too. Kwame, you had a question about the music. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you both for this really rich conversation. Hey, Corey. I had a question about music, and I feel that since I asked the question, you've talked a lot about music, but still, if there's about the role that music plays and what possibilities it opens up and what limitations, and I feel you've talked a lot about that, but if you have more to say, you can. But I really think I want to pivot my question to focus on this difference in your two books between being in an urban space and being in a rural space. So how does music, vibe, and feeling, how can you say anything about how those experiences, what the urban particularly, how that may shape those experiences, or in your case, Corey, how the rural may shape those experiences, or the role of music? So anything in that world.
I think for me, and this is not to collapse any differences between the urban and the rural, but I think the feelings that I'm talking about are so contained, for lack of a better word, to the site of the party. Like, kind of like, no matter where you're coming from tonight, you know, in these 5-6 hours, we're going to try to like produce a space that is just us being here right now. And that, yeah, so I guess I'm not, I don't think this is what you were asking necessarily, but I don't kind of think that the feeling or the vibe changes depending on you know, the sort of geographic region we're in. Certainly the soundtrack will change. But the way that I'm thinking about feeling, and I think maybe this is the putting words in Corey's mouth as well, is it is the effect of cohabitation in some regard. And so it kind of doesn't really matter where that happens. It is the sort of the word that we put on the affect of being in shared space together. And I think what's interesting about Corey's book is like, I'm talking about how that happens, like, you know, in one night, you know, over the span of a few hours in one space. And Corey, you know, sort of takes it out of the 252 and is sort of like, you know, we're in Raleigh right now, and yet, you know, the vibe of the 252 is very present in this seemingly random, you know, unattached space. And so, of course, feeling travels, affect travels. But I think for me, I was just really interested in this, the specificity of like struggles to produce the vibe right now, right here. And that it's like it's a struggle. Yeah. Corey, did you want to respond?
Oh, nah, nothing to add.
Okay, Louis, your question was about sociologists, earlier generations of them.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry for asking too many questions. What I wrote was about Esther Newton, how her I got what you're talking about, Kemi, about the language of sociology. And when I think back to Mother Camp, it is very dry and it's very, you know, I don't want to say pseudoscientific, because I mean, it was thought of as scientific at the time, but then the Cherry Grove book she wrote is so personal and so warm. And I think that is still called sociology. And so I guess my question's for Corey. Well, it's a two-part question, kind of, because the idea of why women, sort of the foundational women of sociology, neglected, I'd say, Black queer women, and then whether or not you think that people like her and that kind of work is still valuable because of, to me, the way that the language has changed, perhaps.
Oh yeah, thank you. So yeah, so yeah, I think, yeah, those, and it's interesting, right? Because part of it is thinking about, when does it not be sociology anymore, right? Can even if sociologists can kind of recognize it and see a utility to it, and the person who produced it has a degree in sociology, or maybe even work in sociology, does that make it sociology? Kind of thinking about, when does something not be that a thing anymore? And so part of it, I guess, like my thinking is, I think there are people with sociology degrees that do a type of, right, beautiful work, like you're mentioning. And so today, I think somebody mentioned in the chat, like Tressie. So like thick, to me, North Carolina, again, it's probably, it made me feel happy to be a sociologist. And I've never really felt that way before. So Kwame, who asked the other question, is my dissertation advisor. He's an anthropologist. And so like a lot of my training is from him. And yeah, and I think a lot of, and part of, I think about the goals and the dreams and desires of sociologists. And I think part of the disciplinary goals, particularly what's happening right now with theory and society, is that sociology is trying to be too activist centered, and we need to get the discipline back to telling us about objective reality and sociology, right, needs to hold on to its scientific roots. And that's kind of like one of the mainstream conversations of the discipline. And then so part of it then becomes about work by sociologists that are beautiful may be ordered into that thing, right? Where we may see value in it without really changing the assumptions of the discipline. And then, so I'm thinking about work who's kind of been marginalized across time, often does it because of the way the assumptions of the discipline would just have to be different. But I think the discipline sees a type of utility from work that is different. And then we can claim it as sociology, in part, not because we necessarily value it, but to kind of tamper down its insurgent possibilities. And yeah, and so for me, I mean, I think sociologists produce interesting work, and to me, the best sociology work wouldn't be considered like mainstream sociology, right? They might develop a subsection called good writing sociology, and yeah, and I feel like I'm the wrong person to answer the question because I got a degree in sociology, but I don't know, right? I don't like it doesn't really control my imagination, and so part of what I'm trying to think about is a person who really loves this discipline and kind of works through it. Kind of what would their dreams and desires be? And for me, I think having a degree in sociology, right, allows you to do a particular type of work. And I think the most important things I've seen from sociology PhDs aren't things the discipline would label as sociology. And
This sounds exactly like musicology right now. So
Antonio, would you like to jump in? You have questions for both Kemi and Corey.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a great conversation, and I'm so eager to delve deeper into both of your books. Corey, I asked the question about where does vibe reside in music? Does it reside in the sound of music, or is it produced through the interaction between the listener and the music? Or none of the above?
no, yeah, I think a lot of times when I ask a person, like, hey, describe your music, or like talk to me about your music, people would play the music, right? It wouldn't be this narration. And for me, it's something about the song, maybe the non-wordness of it, to where I remember an artist, right, Drop, he has this song where he's like, I was ready from the start, little nigga, right? Because I got a big heart, little nigga. And like he said, little nigga at the end of like each line. And then when he was playing the song in front of me, I started like doing the little nigga part. And in part because I like the song, but I feel like if I would have told him, oh, I like the song, or that song's dope, right? That would have communicated, right, something. But I think me, with my cracked voice, struggling to kind of find, right, the right pitch, shape the vibe of that moment, or it shaped kind of the texture or relationship to each other. And so for me, then vibe becomes kind of like this constellation of things kind of coming in contact. So yeah, so I think it's definitely produced by the space you're in, by the folks who are involved, by the histories of the people, by the identities, by our imaginations, our memories, and then that thing that shapes that moment, that makes that moment become a moment that we can remember, that thing that jogs our right imagination and senses. To me, that becomes the vibe. And yeah, and then so that's like there's multiple ways relationality comes in contact. And so things and ideas that we don't even really know are at play, right, shapes the texture of kind of how our bodies feel in that moment. And for me, like that's kind of where vibe comes in there.
Thank you so much. That was a really rich explanation about what the vibe is. Interaction is kind of explanation. And Kemi, I had a question about embodiment in your research. I know you're a dancer, I think I read that. So, you know, are there different ways that people were in their body when the vibe felt right or felt good? Or what can you say about the embodiment of emotions?
I'm not a dancer, except for at the club, but I'm trained in performance studies, which basically takes the body as its primary unit of analysis, and taking the body seriously as a unit of analysis. So a lot of the book is very, or at least I hope, very detailed analysis of how people are moving in relation to the music that's being played. And I think this might also get a little bit to Rory's question, but like, what can we learn when people stop dancing, when there's like a dissonance between movement and music, and what can we learn about feeling when the room is synced together, everybody's swag surfing. Or I talk a lot in one of my chapters about dance ciphers that pop up and how the ciphers are places where Black queer women teach one another how to dance, but also they teach them into a sort of Black queer lesbian sociality. And it's all, in the movement. Like, I'm not asking in my interviews, when did you feel most like a Black lesbian? It's watching them correct one another's movements and bring them into similar sort of affective comportment, or correcting like your bad vibe over there, and physically bringing you into a good feeling over here in order to produce a kind of sociality that feels right. And it's all about management of the body in relationship to the soundscape. And so that's also another point where a lot of conflicts emerge between dancers and party organizers, because the music is so important to, of course, the movement, but also the sort of queer sociality of the place. The successes or failures of the DJ in conversation with the party organizer become really, really, really contentious sites of, you're not just like harshing my vibe right now, like you are ruining the potential of Black queer sociality. And so all of the politicking that I'm talking about really comes out in the embodied management of like the sound and how it's shaping dancing, but how it's shaping conversation, how it's shaping, interactions, sort of between one another. Yeah, that's kind of the shortest answer. But in the interview part, I am asking them a lot about, how do you dance? Can you tell me about your first memories dancing? What was a time that you felt your dancing was corrected? Like, what will get you on, like, just quite like what will get you on to the dance floor? What will get you off of the dance floor? Because those questions about dance just became more interesting than my more targeted questions about like, how do you feel about the community, basically, because starting with thinking about their own bodies, just like, I think opened up more like warm, for lack of a better word, conversation. It felt more intimate to like basically be talking about politics, but doing it like from their own bodies first and foremost. And so kind of early on, I made most of my interviewing just, let's talk about how you dance, when, where, and why do you dance? What feels good, what feels bad? And then kind of go from there.
Thank you so
Oh, this is such a rich conversation, and I hate to cut us short, but we are actually almost at the 5:30 mark. And so I think we should probably thank Corey and Kemi for this amazing conversation. And thanks to all of you for coming and being part of it. I want to remind you that our next program is on a week from today, right? February 12th. We're going to hear from Bob Apatow talking about body count, and Michelle Dumas on Cardi B's Invasion of Privacy book. And it should be just a really wonderful and continuation of some of the themes from today. So thanks again, everybody. We hopefully will actually, maybe we'll stop here